The idea of loving one's enemies has always intrigued and challenged humanity. When Jesus, in his famous Sermon on the Mount, proclaimed, "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you," he not only brought a message of peace, but broke a logic deeply rooted in the human heart and in the social structures of his time. It was a revolutionary call to abandon the cycle of retribution and hatred. For those who heard his words, this instruction seemed not only countercultural, but almost impossible to apply. However, it was this radicalism that conferred transformative power to his message. In the historical context, the world in which Jesus lived was marked by intense social divisions, oppression from the Roman Empire, and a view of justice based on reciprocity. The maxim, "an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," originating from Mosaic law, dominated interpersonal and social relations. This approach, despite limiting disproportionate revenge, still upheld violence as a valid response to offenses. However, Jesus proposed an alternative that seemed insane to many, replacing hate with love. Loving one's enemies meant transcending the common logic of retribution and connecting with a higher spiritual dimension. It wasn't just about forgiving, but about wishing well to those who had caused harm. It was an invitation to break away from the current of hatred, replacing it with a current of compassion. By challenging his followers to practice this form of love, Jesus demonstrated that authentic love was neither conditional nor limited, but universal and unconditional. This approach required courage and self-control. Jesus knew that love for enemies was not a spontaneous feeling, but an intentional practice. He presented forgiveness and love as spiritual acts that liberated both the offender and the offended. The ability to love an enemy represented a victory over the ego and reactivity, making room for inner peace. The enemy, in this context, ceased to be an external threat and became a mirror reflecting each person's internal battles. Furthermore, by proposing love as the answer to hate, Jesus offered a revolutionary model of resistance. It was a peaceful resistance that disarmed the aggressor without resorting to violence. Martin Luther King Jr., inspired by this philosophy, stated that love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Jesus was laying the groundwork for a spiritual code that would span centuries, inspiring leaders and movements that sought peace amidst conflict. But what made this message so hard to accept? In part, it was the direct confrontation with human pride. To love an enemy seemed to many a demonstration of weakness or submission. However, Jesus reversed this narrative, presenting love as the greatest force of all. He taught that forgiveness and love did not diminish those who offered them, but expanded their spiritual capacity. It was a force that freed from the weight of resentment and the cycle of violence. The teachings of Jesus were not merely theoretical. He fully embodied them in his life. Even on the cross, while enduring the most brutal of punishments, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This extreme demonstration of love for his enemies transcended words and turned into action. Jesus showed that true love does not depend on circumstances, but is a conscious choice that comes from the heart. The practice of this love also served as a tool to break prejudices and divisions. By treating others with dignity, regardless of who they were, Jesus challenged the social and religious norms of his time. He demonstrated that everyone was worthy of love and respect, not because of merits, but because the divine essence resided in each one. This universalist view was at the heart of his message. However, loving one's enemies did not mean ignoring justice or tolerating evil. It was a way of dealing with adversities so as not to perpetuate the destructive cycle. Divine justice, according to Jesus, was not a justice of retribution, but of restoration. Loving an enemy was a way to restore both the soul of the one who loved and the one who received that love. Jesus' proposal pointed to something greater than human relationships. It was a call to spiritual reconciliation, an invitation to experience unity with the divine through unconditional love. For him, love was the language of the kingdom of God, and loving one's enemies was an essential step towards living in accordance with this kingdom. In the end, Jesus' message remains a profound challenge for the modern human. Loving one's enemies requires an inner strength that can only be cultivated through spiritual practice. It's an invitation to transcend primitive impulses and embrace a more conscious and elevated existence. Above all, it is an opportunity for transformation, not just for those who love, but for the world as a whole. Forgiveness. A simple word that carries the weight of an emotional and spiritual universe. Jesus, in his mission, positioned forgiveness as one of the deepest foundations of the spiritual path. It was not an occasional suggestion, but a ceaseless invitation for humanity to find true liberation, both from their own hurts and the chains that bind the heart to the past. Forgiveness, in its essence, was the key to reconciliation, both inward and outward. In the Jewish tradition of the time, forgiveness was seen as part of religious practice, but it had clear limits. Forgiving once or even 3 times was considered sufficient, as a demonstration of benevolence. When Jesus responded to Peter saying that forgiveness should be offered 70 times 7, he was not setting an exact number, but expressing the infinity of this practice. Forgiveness was not a concession, but a continuous state of compassion and grace. One of the most striking examples of the transformative power of forgiveness is in the parable of the prodigal son. In this narrative, the father, instead of harboring resentment for his son's offense, chooses to welcome him with open arms, celebrating his return. This image reflects God's unconditional love, a love that doesn't demand explanations or reparations, but rejoices in reconciliation. Here, forgiveness is described not as an obligation, but as a celebration of redemption and renewal. Forgiveness is also displayed in the most intense moments of Jesus' life, particularly on his path to the cross. When faced with betrayals, abuses, and humiliations, he not only preached, but lived forgiveness. His prayer for those who crucified him, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," resonates as one of the most powerful acts in all of history. It was not just a demonstration of kindness, but a cry for spiritual freedom amidst brutality. As we reflect on the impact of forgiveness, we realize that it not only liberates the one who is forgiven, but transforms the one who grants it. Modern psychology confirms what spiritual teachings already knew. Forgiveness reduces emotional burden, relieves stress, and promotes an inner peace that is seldom achieved by other means. It allows the person to break the cycle of resentment, leaving behind a weight that they do not need to carry. However, forgiveness should not be confused with passive acceptance of injustices or forgetting a mistake. Jesus did not encourage the denial of wounds, but their overcoming. Forgiveness, in this sense, is an active act, an internal movement that requires courage. It is necessary to face the pain head-on, understand its origin, and consciously decide to free oneself from it. It is not an attitude of weakness, but of spiritual strength. An impactful example of transformative forgiveness in modern times is the story of Nelson Mandela. After spending 27 years in prison, he chose to forgive those who incarcerated him. He understood that without this forgiveness, he could not lead South Africa on its journey of reconciliation. Mandela, inspired by values such as those of Jesus, demonstrated that forgiveness has a power that goes beyond the individual, shaping entire societies. Forgiveness, however, often faces resistance from the ego. There is a sense of justice that seems violated when we forgive someone who has hurt us. This resistance is natural, but Jesus challenged his followers to transcend this barrier. He taught that forgiveness is not about what the other person deserves, but about what the heart needs. Forgiveness is a choice that opens doors to a lighter life and connection with the divine. There is also a deeply spiritual aspect to forgiveness. It is an opportunity to acknowledge our shared humanity. When we forgive, we recognize that we are all prone to mistakes, and that love is more powerful than judgment. This perspective aligns our soul with that of the Creator, who always offers grace, even in our imperfection. It is a practice that uplifts the spirit and strengthens faith. The impact of forgiveness is not just individual, but collective. Imagine a world where grudges were replaced by reconciliation. Jesus, in emphasizing forgiveness, pointed towards a global transformation, where human relationships would be marked by empathy and love, instead of hatred and revenge. This is the invitation he continues to make, an opportunity to build bridges where there were once walls. In the end, forgiveness is an act of faith. By forgiving, we trust that the universe, God, or life itself will take care of what is fair. It's a surrender that requires trust, but always comes back with blessings. Loving our enemies and forgiving them is the most sublime act of freedom. By doing so, we not only follow the example of Jesus, but we also free ourselves from the shackles that prevent us from living fully. Hate, a dense and corrosive emotion, is often seen as something to be eliminated at all costs. However, the teachings of Jesus offer a surprising perspective. Hate can be transformed into a catalyst for spiritual growth. This transformation, however, requires a deep look within oneself, a willingness to face the shadows of one's own heart, and a connection with divine love that transcends human understanding. Jesus did not deny the reality of hatred. He understood that, as human beings, we are often confronted with intense emotions in the face of injustice, betrayal, or suffering. However, he called us not to be slaves to these emotions. Instead of letting hatred consume our energy and distance us from peace, Jesus challenged us to channel this force into introspection and spiritual elevation. Hatred is often a reaction to what we cannot control or understand. It arises from pain, fear, and a sense of separation. However, it is at this point that its transformative opportunity lies. Jesus showed us that by facing these emotions, we can access deeper truths about ourselves and our relationship with the world. Hatred, when recognized, can become a tool to discover the wounds that still need to be healed. A powerful example of how Jesus transformed hatred into spiritual growth is seen in his interaction with the Pharisees and Sadducees, who frequently attacked and conspired against him. He did not respond with anger or resentment, but with patience and wisdom. Instead of being carried away by hostility, he used these situations to teach profound lessons about love, forgiveness, and compassion. Jesus looked beyond the words of hate. He saw the souls of those who were lost in their own internal struggles. The love for our enemies, therefore, is not just a way to challenge external hatred, but to confront the hatred we carry within us. Jesus knew that as long as we are trapped in resentment, we are spiritually stagnant. He taught us that forgiveness and love are not only gifts for others, but a liberation for ourselves. It is an act of setting aside the weight that prevents us from moving forward. The transformation of hatred into spiritual growth requires practice and awareness. First, it is necessary to recognize the emotion without judgment. Hatred, like any other emotion, is a message about something that needs attention. Jesus invited us to bring light to these dark areas of our soul, allowing divine love to transform what seemed to be irreparable. Prayer, in this process, plays a crucial role. When Jesus taught to pray for enemies, he was not just suggesting an act of kindness, but a means of transcending human limitations. Prayer connects us with a source of love that goes beyond our personal capacity. By praying for those who hurt us, we make room for divine grace to work in both our hearts and theirs. Another powerful spiritual tool is the practice of compassion. Jesus often saw hatred as a reflection of the pain of those who expressed it. He understood that others' actions were often driven by their own internal struggles. This understanding does not mean justifying evil, but recognizing shared humanity. This perspective helps us transform hatred into empathy, paving the way for forgiveness and reconciliation. Channeling hatred towards spiritual growth also requires courage to confront the ego. The ego, which feeds on offenses and injustices, resists love for enemies. It prefers the cycle of revenge and resentment, as this reinforces its identity. Jesus calls us to transcend this cycle, to abandon attachment to wounded pride, and to embrace a broader perspective, rooted in universal love. Real and inspiring stories illustrate how this transformation can happen. A modern example is that of Immaculée Ilibagiza, a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda. After losing almost her entire family, she faced overwhelming hatred. However, amidst the pain, she found spiritual strength to forgive those who had committed atrocities. This choice not only freed her from the weight of hatred, but also transformed her into a voice of peace and reconciliation. Beyond the spiritual impact, transforming hatred into growth affects our physical and emotional health. Studies show that prolonged hatred increases stress levels and causes harm to the body. On the other hand, the practice of forgiveness and love reduces anxiety, improves immunity, and promotes overall well-being. When Jesus called us to love our enemies, he was not only caring for our souls, but also for our holistic health. This journey of transformation is not easy, but it is deeply rewarding. Jesus promised that those who followed his path would find rest for their souls. This includes the rest that comes from leaving behind the weight of hatred and embracing the freedom of love. By transforming hatred into spiritual growth, we not only follow Jesus' example, but we draw closer to our divine essence. At the heart of Jesus' message is the challenge to transcend the ego. Loving one's enemies is not merely an emotional choice, but a spiritual battle against the pride and self-preservation that the ego fiercely protects. This duality between ego and spirituality creates an internal battlefield that, if understood and overcome, can lead to profound and lasting transformation. The ego is a powerful force. It feeds on separation, divisions, and narratives that reinforce an identity isolated from the whole. When someone hurts or threatens us, the ego immediately reacts to protect its position. It seeks to justify resentments and fuel feelings of superiority or victimization. Jesus, however, challenged this dynamic by teaching that true strength lies in responding to hatred with love and to pride with humility. For many, this teaching is disconcerting because it directly confronts the ego's logic. Loving an enemy seems at first glance like a defeat. But Jesus knew that the ego confuses weakness with strength, feeding on conflict and separation. He showed that real strength comes from the ability to transcend reactivity, choosing the path of compassion, even in the face of offense. This tension between ego and spirituality is evident in the difficulty of forgiveness. The ego insists that forgiveness is a concession, a loss of power. However, Jesus revealed that forgiveness is, in fact, an act of liberation. By forgiving, we are not justifying the other's action, but freeing ourselves from the emotional prison that resentment creates. This is one of the greatest spiritual paradoxes. By letting go of bitterness, we find true freedom. A powerful example of this internal struggle can be found in the story of Peter. When he asked Jesus how many times he should forgive, he may have expected a reasonable limit, something to comfort his ego. But Jesus replied, 70 times 7. This number symbolizes infinity, something beyond rational comprehension. Peter had to confront his own pride and make room for a more expansive love, one that is not bound by calculations or conditions. The ego also resists love for enemies because it threatens its sense of identity. When we identify with our hurts, these wounds become part of who we believe we are. To forgive or love an enemy requires abandoning this narrative, which can seem scary. However, Jesus taught that our true identity is not in the wounded ego, but in our connection with the divine, where love reigns supreme. This process of transcending the ego requires spiritual practices that strengthen the soul. Meditation and prayer, for example, help to silence the voice of the ego and make room for the divine presence. When Jesus withdrew to pray, he demonstrated the importance of reconnecting with the source of love. These practices not only calm the mind, but also help us to see the world through the eyes of compassion. Another key to overcoming the ego is service to others. When we serve, especially those who have hurt us, we weaken the ego's control over our actions. Jesus exemplified this by washing the feet of his disciples, including Judas, who would betray him. This act of humility and unconditional love reveals that true greatness lies in serving, not in dominating. The journey of overcoming the ego also involves accepting the impermanence of offenses. The ego tends to cling to grievances, magnifying their importance and prolonging suffering. But Jesus taught to live in the present, to let go of the weight of the past, and to trust in the flow of life. Loving enemies means, in part, releasing this emotional burden and choosing peace over conflict. However, this journey is not without its challenges. The ego often masquerades as justice, trying to convince us that our resentment is valid and necessary. For this reason, spiritual vigilance is essential. We need to be alert to the traps of pride and the desire for retribution, allowing the light of love to guide us even in the most challenging situations. A contemporary example of someone who has overcome this duality is the Dalai Lama. Exiled from his homeland and facing decades of oppression, he chose compassion over hatred. He often asserts that forgiveness is not a weakness, but a strength that comes from inner peace. His life exemplifies what Jesus taught: love is the most powerful weapon against suffering. Finally, overcoming the ego does not mean completely denying it, but balancing it with spirituality. The ego has its function, but it should be a servant, not a master. Jesus called us to this integration, where the ego submits to love and compassion. When we achieve this harmony, love for enemies ceases to be an impossible burden and becomes a natural expression of our true essence. The history of humanity is filled with figures who embodied Jesus' message about loving one's enemies, demonstrating how this practice can transform lives, societies, and even the course of history. These examples not only validate the depth of this teaching, but also show that love for enemies is a real and possible path, even in seemingly insurmountable circumstances. One of the most notable examples is Mahatma Gandhi, who led the fight for India's independence based on the principle of nonviolence. Although inspired by his Hindu roots, Gandhi acknowledged the impact of Jesus' teachings, especially the Sermon on the Mount, on his life philosophy. He rejected the idea of responding to British oppression with violence, and instead encouraged his followers to resist peacefully, treating their oppressors with dignity and compassion. Gandhi often said that love for enemies was not weakness, but the highest expression of courage. Another extraordinary example is Martin Luther King Jr., who led the civil rights movement in the United States, directly inspired by Jesus' message of love and forgiveness. King believed that the fight for racial equality could not be won with hatred or resentment, but with unconditional love. He often spoke about the power of love to disarm even the hardest hearts. In one of his most famous speeches, he stated, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." His peaceful leadership not only challenged racial segregation, but also inspired a cultural and spiritual transformation in millions of people. Jesus also made a profound impact during his own time through his relationship with the marginalized and those considered enemies. A clear example of this is his encounter with Zacchaeus, the tax collector. At that time, tax collectors were despised for extorting the people for the benefit of the Roman Empire. When Jesus chose to visit Zacchaeus' house, he not only challenged social norms, but also demonstrated that even those considered enemies were worthy of love and redemption. The result was a complete transformation in Zacchaeus' life, who returned what he had taken and committed to a life of integrity. In the contemporary world, the story of Nelson Mandela stands out as a shining example of the transformative power of love and forgiveness. After spending 27 years imprisoned under the apartheid regime in South Africa, Mandela emerged not as a vengeful leader, but as a champion of reconciliation. He understood that only love and forgiveness could unite a divided nation. His decision to forgive his oppressors not only restored his dignity, but also inspired a process of collective healing in his country. Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch Christian who survived the Nazi concentration camps, provides another powerful example. After the war, she met one of the guards who had worked at the camp where her sister died. He asked for forgiveness for his actions, and Corrie, with great difficulty, chose to forgive him. She described the moment as an act that required divine strength, but which freed her from the weight of hatred. Her story continues to inspire millions to follow the path of forgiveness, even in situations of deep pain. These historical and biblical figures illustrate that loving one's enemies is not a distant theory, but a practice that can shape realities. In each case, love was a force capable of transforming not only the people directly involved, but also their communities and, in some cases, the world. The power of transformative love lies in its ability to break cycles of hatred and violence, replacing them with compassion and hope. These stories also reveal that love for enemies requires a commitment to higher spiritual principles. None of these figures acted based on fleeting feelings or emotional responses. Instead, they relied on a larger vision, in which love was seen as the foundation of true freedom. Loving enemies did not mean ignoring injustices, but confronting them with a spirit of reconciliation and grace. Moreover, these examples demonstrate that transformative love has a lasting impact. The actions of Gandhi, King, Mandela, and others still echo today, inspiring new generations to live according to these ideals. Their stories are reminders that by choosing love over hate, we can create a legacy that transcends our lives. Finally, these narratives reinforce Jesus' central teaching. Love for enemies is a path of spiritual growth and world transformation. When we choose to love those who harm us, we connect with the divine essence that resides in all of us. This choice is not easy, but it is the only one capable of breaking the chains of hatred and paving the way for a future of peace and harmony. The transformative power of love and forgiveness, so widely preached by Jesus, is not just a matter of faith or spirituality. Over the past few decades, science has confirmed that these practices have profound and measurable impacts on our physical, mental, and emotional health. This intersection between spirituality and science reveals that love and forgiveness not only connect us to the divine, but also enhance the quality of our lives in surprising ways. Scientific studies show that forgiveness can significantly reduce stress. When we are resentful or full of anger, our body enters a fight-or-flight state. This increases levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which, in the long run, can lead to problems such as hypertension, anxiety, insomnia, and even heart disease. However, by choosing to forgive, the body experiences a reduction in these levels, promoting calmness and well-being. Jesus, in emphasizing forgiveness, pointed not only to spiritual liberation, but also to physical renewal. The impact of forgiveness on mental health is also notable. Research in psychology suggests that holding grudges is associated with symptoms of depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. In contrast, people who practice forgiveness often report greater life satisfaction, healthier relationships, and higher emotional resilience. This happens because forgiving frees us from the emotional weight we carry, allowing us to live more fully and presently. The love for enemies, another central practice in Jesus' teachings, has also been the subject of scientific study. Compassion, which is the basis of this love, is associated with the release of oxytocin, a hormone often referred to as the love hormone. Oxytocin not only promotes feelings of connection and well-being, but also has physiological benefits, such as reducing inflammation and improving the immune system. Thus, by choosing to love our enemies, we not only experience spiritual growth, but also strengthen our bodies. Another fascinating field of study is the neuroscience of forgiveness. Researchers have found that when practicing forgiveness, specific areas of the brain related to empathy and emotional regulation, such as the prefrontal cortex, are activated. This suggests that forgiving is not just a spiritual act, but also a neurological exercise that reconfigures our mind. In a way, the practice of forgiveness strengthens our ability to handle emotional challenges and to relate in a more compassionate manner with others. Furthermore, positive psychology, a branch of psychology that studies human strengths and virtues, reinforces the benefits of love and forgiveness. Research shows that people who practice gratitude, a fundamental component of love and forgiveness, experience greater happiness and optimism. Gratitude helps us to reorient our focus, moving us away from offenses and directing our attention to the blessings in our lives. This practice aligns with Jesus' message of living with a heart full of love and gratitude. Science also points to the social effects of forgiveness. Studies reveal that communities and groups that practice forgiveness experience greater cohesion and less violence. When individuals choose to forgive, they break cycles of resentment and retribution, creating a more peaceful and collaborative environment. This collective impact reflects what Jesus taught. Love and forgiveness have the power to transform not only individuals, but entire societies. An interesting aspect of these studies is how forgiveness can be taught and cultivated. Many therapeutic and educational programs incorporate techniques based on empathy and compassion to help people overcome resentment. These programs often include meditation exercises, mindful breathing, and visualization, practices that help quiet the ego and make room for genuine forgiveness. This reinforces that love for enemies, although challenging, is a skill that can be developed with dedication and practice. The intersection between science and spirituality also sheds light on the role of faith in the forgiveness process. Research shows that people with a strong spiritual or religious connection are more likely to forgive. This is because faith provides a larger context for understanding suffering and finding purpose, even in difficult situations. Jesus, in preaching forgiveness, pointed to a universal truth. Spirituality gives us strength to overcome our human limitations and access a higher dimension of love. These scientific insights also invite us to reflect on the practice of forgiveness in our daily lives. Jesus did not propose forgiveness as a single or extraordinary act, but as a lifestyle. He knew that by constantly forgiving, we create a cycle of healing and transformation. Science confirms that small regular practices, such as meditating on forgiveness or expressing compassion, can have profound impacts on our health and well-being. Finally, the science of love and forgiveness validates what Jesus taught over 2,000 years ago, that these practices are not just spiritual acts, but paths to a full and healthy life. Loving our enemies and forgiving those who hurt us is not a renunciation, but a powerful choice that transforms our mind, our body, and our spirit. This union between faith and science reminds us that Jesus' teachings are not just spiritual ideals, but universal truths that can guide us to a more balanced and happy existence. Jesus not only taught about love and forgiveness, he revealed a universal code of reconciliation that transcends cultures, religions, and times. This message, rooted in compassion and unity, points to a spiritual truth that unites all of humanity. Reconciliation, according to Jesus, is more than resolving conflicts. It's a return to the original state of harmony with God, with ourselves, and with others. The concept of reconciliation in Jesus' teaching is intrinsically linked to unconditional love. He did not see divisions among people as something final, but as temporary barriers that could be overcome through forgiveness and empathy. This principle is deeply illustrated in his parable of the Good Samaritan, where a man marginalized by society shows more compassion than those considered religious. This story not only challenges prejudices, but also reveals that reconciliation requires seeing beyond apparent differences and recognizing shared humanity. Jesus also incorporated reconciliation into his actions. By associating with tax collectors, prostitutes, and others considered sinners, he tore down walls of exclusion and prejudice. For him, no one was beyond the reach of love and redemption. His approach was not of condemnation, but of healing and acceptance. he demonstrated that the first step towards reconciliation was to treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their past choices. The reconciliation code of Jesus also challenges the logic of reciprocity. Instead of demanding that the other side take the initiative or deserve forgiveness, he taught that reconciliation begins in the heart of the one willing to love. This principle is summarized in his words: "If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also." Although often misunderstood as submission, this teaching reflects the spiritual strength to break the cycle of retribution and make room for peace. One of the most powerful manifestations of this code was his attitude towards those who crucified him. Despite the brutality and injustice he faced, Jesus prayed for his tormentors, asking the Father to forgive them. This attitude not only demonstrates his commitment to unconditional love, but also illustrates that reconciliation does not depend on the actions of others, but on each individual's choice to act with compassion. The message of Jesus finds resonance in various spiritual traditions around the world, reinforcing its universal character. In Buddhism, the practice of compassion and detachment from resentment is fundamental to achieving inner peace. In Islam, forgiveness is exalted as a divine quality to be reflected in its followers. Even in non-theistic belief systems, such as humanism, the value of reconciliation to promote collective well-being is widely recognized. These parallels show that Jesus' code resonates with universal wisdom. This principle also manifests itself in the historical impact of leaders who followed in their footsteps. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mahatma Gandhi not only preached reconciliation, they lived it. Inspired by spiritual values that place love above hate, they demonstrated that reconciliation is not just a personal virtue, but a force capable of transforming entire societies. Their lives exemplify that Jesus' code is practical, powerful, and applicable even in the most challenging situations. Reconciliation, however, is not just an external process. Jesus also invited us to seek internal reconciliation. He knew that many of the divisions we see in the external world reflect conflicts within us. His call to love our enemies is ultimately a call to reconcile our wounded parts, our fears, and our pride. When we allow ourselves to heal, we become more effective agents of healing in the world. Furthermore, the reconciliation code includes a responsibility aspect. Jesus emphasized that before offering a gift at the altar, we should seek reconciliation with those we have harmed. This teaching reinforces that reconciliation is not passive, but active. It requires us to take concrete initiatives to repair relationships, admit mistakes, and build bridges. This vision of reconciliation also has profound implications for the future of humanity. In a world marked by divisions, historical resentments, and ideological conflicts, Jesus' code offers a way to overcome these barriers. It reminds us that true peace does not come from uniformity, but from unity in diversity. Reconciliation, in this context, is the recognition that, despite our differences, we share a divine essence. Finally, the universal code of reconciliation is an invitation to daily practice. It is not something reserved for major moments of conflict, but a life approach. By choosing to love, forgive, and seek harmony in our daily interactions, we become part of a current of transformation that starts within us and extends to the world. Jesus showed us that reconciliation is not merely a spiritual ideal, but a tangible reality that we can build, an act of faith and love that has the power to redeem both our souls and the plan. Jesus' call to love our enemies was not just a moral or ethical teaching, it was a principle that transcends cultures, times, and circumstances. His message resonates through the centuries because it addresses one of humanity's greatest struggles: overcoming hatred and division to achieve a state of inner peace and collective harmony. This timeless wisdom has not only shaped individual lives, but also influenced societies and transformed the way we understand the nature of love. The strength of this teaching lies in its simplicity and depth. Loving friends is natural, loving enemies, revolutionary. Jesus introduced unconditional love as the foundation of the kingdom of God. This type of love, known as agape in biblical Greek, goes beyond emotions or personal preferences. It is a conscious decision to seek good, even for those who have harmed us. This love transcends ego, logic, and circumstances, inviting us to access a higher spiritual dimension. The wisdom of loving one's enemies begins with the understanding that hatred perpetuates suffering, while love has the power to heal. Jesus knew that the cycle of revenge and bitterness not only destroys relationships, but also corrodes the soul. When we choose the path of love, we break these chains and free ourselves and others from the weight of resentment. This teaching is not only spiritual, but also deeply practical, offering a solution for personal and collective conflicts. This principle is also rooted in the understanding that all human beings share a divine essence. Jesus invited us to look beyond a person's actions and behaviors, to recognize the spark of God that dwells within them. This perspective helps us overcome the tendency to dehumanize enemies and encourages us to treat everyone with dignity and compassion. When we understand that the other is a reflection of ourselves, love for enemies ceases to be a difficult obligation and becomes a natural expression of our spiritual unity. The practice of loving one's enemies also reveals a dimension of power. This is not about weakness or submission, but about inner strength. Jesus demonstrated this in his own life, facing betrayals, rejections, and even crucifixion with an unshakable spirit of love. He showed that true power lies in maintaining spiritual integrity, regardless of external circumstances. This power is transformative because it disarms hatred, replacing it with compassion. Furthermore, loving one's enemies does not mean tolerating injustices or ignoring evil. Jesus never asked his followers to abandon their pursuit of justice, but to approach it with a pure heart. He knew that hatred only perpetuates violence, while love has the power to transform. This balance between justice and compassion is central to Jesus' teaching and invites us to act in a way that promotes healing and restoration rather than destruction. The timeless wisdom of Jesus also offers a path to inner peace. Resentment and hatred are heavy burdens we carry, often without realizing it. When we choose to love our enemies, we free ourselves from this weight and find a freedom that cannot be taken away. This inner peace is one of the greatest blessings of unconditional love and connects us to the essence of Jesus' teaching. Moreover, the impact of loving one's enemies extends beyond the individual. It has the power to transform communities and even nations. When people choose to respond to hatred with love, they create a ripple effect that inspires others to do the same. Stories of reconciliation, like that of Nelson Mandela and the peaceful transition in South Africa, demonstrate the collective power of this practice. Jesus understood that unconditional love was the only force capable of healing humanity's deepest wounds. This teaching also challenges us to reassess the meaning of victory. In the world's logic, winning means dominating or defeating. In Jesus' logic, winning means loving, even in the most difficult circumstances. This type of victory is not immediately visible, but it has a lasting and eternal impact. It is a victory that transforms both the heart of the one who loves and the one who is loved. The wisdom of loving our enemies also invites us to reflect on our role in the spiritual evolution of humanity. Each act of love is a contribution to the advancement of collective consciousness. Jesus, in teaching this principle, was showing us the path to a future where compassion is the norm and hatred is overcome. He knew that love for enemies was a key to unlocking the divine potential that resides in every human being. In the end, this message remains an open invitation. Loving your enemies is not easy, but it is deeply transformative. It is a path that requires courage, faith, and a constant commitment to spiritual practice. Jesus showed us that this love is not only possible, but also essential for our journey as individuals and as a society. His timeless wisdom reminds us that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transforming hatred into understanding, pain into healing, and conflict into peace. Jesus' teaching about loving one's enemies remains one of humanity's deepest and most relevant challenges. In a world marked by divisions, conflicts, and polarization, the practice of unconditional love emerges as a path towards individual and collective transformation. However, applying this timeless wisdom to our reality requires courage, reflection, and conscious action. The first step to living this teaching in the present is to recognize that love for enemies begins within us. Jesus knew that external wars are reflections of internal battles. When we harbor resentment, fear, or hatred, we project these emotions onto our relationships and communities. Loving our enemies, therefore, is a call to look at our own shadows, identify the wounds that fuel our negative feelings, and allow divine love to heal us. This process of inner healing is directly linked to the practice of forgiveness. In a world where offenses and conflicts are inevitable, forgiveness emerges as an essential skill for peace. This doesn't mean justifying wrong actions, but freeing oneself from the emotional burden these experiences carry. By forgiving, we choose not to be defined by our pain, but by our capacity to love. Jesus demonstrated this by forgiving those who crucified him, showing that forgiveness is a choice of spiritual freedom. Beyond forgiveness, the practice of empathy is fundamental to loving one's enemies. Empathy is the ability to put oneself in another's shoes, understanding their perspectives and emotions. In a world increasingly divided by ideologies and beliefs, cultivating empathy allows us to see beyond differences and recognize shared humanity. Jesus did this repeatedly, interacting with people who were despised or considered unworthy, demonstrating that love knows no barriers. Another important aspect is compassionate communication. Many of today's conflicts arise from misunderstandings, impulsive words, and the inability to listen. Jesus taught us to be peacemakers, not instigators. By choosing our words carefully and listening attentively, we create room for constructive dialogues, even in situations of disagreement. Compassionate communication is a practical tool for disarming hatred and building bridges instead of walls. In practical terms, loving our enemies also means acting with kindness, even when we do not receive the same in return. Small acts of generosity can have a profound impact. By helping someone who has hurt us, or by showing respect for someone who disagrees with us, we put into practice the love that Jesus exemplified. These actions not only touch the hearts of others, but also strengthen our own soul. However, it's important to acknowledge that loving one's enemies is not a path without challenges. We live in an era of social media, where hate speech and polarization are amplified. In this reality, loving one's enemies may seem counterintuitive or even impossible, but it's precisely in these moments that Jesus' teachings become more relevant. He calls us to resist the temptation to retaliate, hate with hate, and instead, respond with compassion and understanding. A practical example of this is the way conflicted communities can choose reconciliation over revenge. Restorative justice initiatives, which promote dialogue between victims and offenders, have shown transformative results. These practices reflect the principles of Jesus, demonstrating that reconciliation not only heals old wounds, but also prevents future cycles of violence. Furthermore, love for enemies has profound implications for leadership and activism. Leaders who embrace compassion and empathy, even in times of crisis, inspire positive changes. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, insisted on nonviolence and love for opponents, even while facing intense opposition. His approach demonstrated that love for enemies is not a sign of weakness, but a revolutionary force that transforms hearts and societies. In the personal sphere, loving our enemies invites us to reflect on how we treat people in our everyday life. We may not face enemies in a literal sense, but we certainly encounter those who frustrate, challenge, or offend us. In these moments, we can practice Jesus' teaching by choosing patience, understanding, and kindness. These small daily decisions add up to a significant impact on our lives and the lives of those around us. Finally, love for our enemies challenges us to envision a different world. Instead of a future marked by endless conflicts, Jesus invites us to visualize a humanity united by compassion. This ideal may seem distant, but every act of love, every gesture of forgiveness, and every choice of reconciliation brings us closer to this vision. Love for our enemies is more than a spiritual ideal. It is a call to action, an opportunity for us to be agents of peace in a world that so desperately needs it. This journey, although challenging, is deeply rewarding. Jesus reminded us that those who follow this path will find rest for their souls. By choosing to love our enemies, we not only follow his example, but also align ourselves with the highest purpose of life, to live in harmony with the divine, with ourselves, and with others. Before we wrap up Mind Unfettered, we want to know, what is the biggest lesson you've learned from the idea of loving your enemies? Share in the comments how you believe we can use the power of love to transform not only our lives, but also the world around us. Who knows? Your insight might inspire someone else who needs this message right now. Remember, when we unite in intention, we manifest a more compassionate and enlightened world. So, leave your comment and let's build together a chain of wisdom and reconciliation. And now, don't stop here. On our screen, you will find the next chapter of this spiritual journey. Hidden Secrets. The secret society that preserved knowledge about Jesus. Discover how hidden secrets were protected for centuries and what they reveal about Jesus' message that still resonates today. Click now and continue expanding your mind with us. Mind Unfettered, always seeking the next level of your evolution.